Hello, I'm Ruth Goodman, and today we'll be talking about the family in Victorian Britain. In the 19th century, men took more control at home than at any other time in history. We'll be discussing the male breadwinner pattern and the employment of boys, and how this affected the whole family. I think many of us, when looking at the Victorian period, imagine that it was part of a continuum, that all history was the same, that men went out to work, women stayed at home, and children filled in around the edges. But actually, that pattern of a man going out to work and a woman staying at home is one that emerged during the Victorian period. It was a change from what had gone before. And it was to be an extremely influential pattern that lasted well into the 20th century. If we were to look back before Victoria came to the throne, we would see a much more mixed pattern of employment, men and women often working side by side, often within the home. We see people sharing many of the making tasks, many of the production systems, that there was often quite a lot of crossover between the work and the lives of men and women. After all, if you lived out in the countryside, for example, working on the land, which after all most people did, you're both in the same spaces, aren't you? You're in and around the farmhouse, in and around the farmyard. The difference was that the men went out into the fields, whereas the women tended to stay closer to home because they had childcare responsibilities. But nonetheless, their work sort of dovetailed. It was as if the whole family was part of a project, everybody putting in what they could in order to survive. Men, women and children together. And early manufacturing was often much the same. The home of a weaver. Everybody within the family is working within that space. The man isn't going off to a factory, he's there with his loom in the attic, and the women and the children are assisting him, helping him, taking over from him at times. Sometimes they're the ones quietly who are doing the main thing and he's not, but to the world they present a front as if he's the weaver, even though the work might be done by any member of the family. This sort of more fluid world was about to undergo a change. The Victorian period sees that working together sort of come apart and become much more separate, in separate places. The rise of factories meant that men's work and women's work didn't overlap in quite the same way. And it also completely changed money and power. Wages for urban industrial workers were considerably higher than wages for agricultural workers. So naturally, people flocked to the towns and cities looking for this new, better paid work. But it was the men who were better paid in general. Some of the women's work was a little bit better paid, but not much. The majority of the good jobs were for men only. So what we see in the Victorian period is a rise in male power, male purchasing power. Men have more money at their disposal than their fathers and grandfathers did. The woman's in much the same position, the children are in much the same position, but the man has more at his disposal. So he can, well, just imagine what a difference that makes within the power relationships in a family. If he's got more money, if you're more dependent on him bringing in the money than you ever were before. And we see that beginning to change in many of the little things in Victorian life. Food on the table is a really big one. It had always been the way that for a working class family, you fed the most food to those doing the most work, because you need to keep them in good nick so they can carry on doing the work. So within urban Victorian families, that means that all the good stuff is being increasingly funneled towards the bloke. Within a family, the women and children are managing on the cheapest food. Bread, bread, bread and more bread. But if there is a bit extra, if there's money for a slice of bacon, it won't be shared equally amongst the family. The slice of bacon goes to the man because he's going to go out and earn more money. So we get a hierarchy of eating within the family. If you were a working class family in, say, 1880, the money that a woman could earn, the wife could earn, because she can't earn super hours because she's still got to do some sort of childcare and housekeeping, is more than, say, a 6-year-old boy could earn. But by the time that lad is 11, he can earn more than his mother. So now everything shifts within the family. Now it makes sense for him to go out to work. And he's bringing home the bacon, and I do mean that quite literally because his work might mean the difference between bacon and no bacon, and he's got a bit of a status within the family. You can see how fundamentally this is going to change family life. A working class family had to use every resource it had, otherwise they were going to starve. So they couldn't afford to ignore these truths and fundamentalities. They just had to go with the flow. This is what you could do. When a couple first got married, she might work as well. And she might work after the birth of the first couple of children. But by the time the first lad is 11, she gives it up and stays at home. And it is the man and the boys who then bring in the money. It changes the nature of housework too. In that early period, when she might be working, the housework has to be sort of done by somebody, and very often the children were pressed into that. So girls and boys from 5 onwards are doing quite a lot of basic stuff around the house. Certainly by the time they're 9, they're taking on quite a big section of the general domestic burden. And if you read the autobiography of young men who were growing up in that era, they often pinpoint how much their lives changed when at about 11, they could start bringing in more money than their mum. Until that point, they were doing chores around the house. They were keeping things going to keep her at work as long as possible. But at that moment, when it flicks over, he gets released from all the household burden. He suddenly doesn't have to do housework again, and he probably never will do it again in his life. And when you read those accounts, they talk about it as freedom. Oh my goodness, how much easier it was to go out to work than to stay at home and do the chores. That's a theme that comes up again and again and again. So we see this pattern of the man out at work and the woman at home being super reinforced. Something that had been a bit woolly becomes much more defined and clearer and separate. Between 1835 and 1850, half of all the people who worked in the textile industry, which was Britain's biggest employer, were under 18 years of age. Child labour had never been at such a premium. Children had traditionally joined in the work of the family in an ad hoc way, usually in their mid to late teens. But when industrialisation kicked off in the 18th century, there was a whole new set of jobs opened up that needed child labour, needed tiny little fingers and small sleek bodies to slip in between machines, to pick things up, to fetch, to carry, to serve the machines. It was also a period in which hunger stalked the lower half of the population. So child labour rose. People needed the money, and there was work. So when we open Queen Victoria's reign, we are at a moment in which there was more child labour at younger ages than there had ever been before, and that there has ever been since. It was the very peak of working children. Throughout the rest of Victoria's reign, very slowly and very gradually, in bits and bobs here and there, new regulations came in which gradually closed down some of the opportunities for child working and encouraged children out of the workplace again. But nonetheless, even at the end of Victoria's reign, working was a normal childhood experience. Maybe a little older by the end of the reign. Maybe people weren't starting until they were 12 or 13 rather than starting at 5 or 6. But nonetheless, childhood involved a great deal of paid work. Now, one of the things that we all think we know about Victorian families was that they all had huge numbers of children. And that is often true. But there is a change coming in the Victorian era. Contraception. And it begins with the middle classes. From the 1880s, you can actually see the effects of contraception turning up in family size. If you look in the censuses and the records, you can see that middle class families are getting smaller. This is not true about the working class, but it's very clear amongst those in the professions, particularly doctors. Doctors found their way to managing their own families, but were not keen on passing that information on to the working classes. A strange way of being, but nonetheless true. The changes come from people's ideas, but also from technology. The first practical alteration comes with the vulcanization of rubber, the making rubber flexible and soft. And then suddenly, condoms, which had been made out of sheep gut and really only used by blokes to stop them getting syphilis, became made of a softer and a cleaner, more cleanable material, rubber, and became more widespread. They were still initially used for keeping people safe from venereal disease rather than contraception, but the idea and the practicalities were beginning to come together. The female cap, too, vulcanization of rubber, made it possible for a woman to begin to take control of her own fertility. There were other older methods which didn't really require new technology but just required people to talk about it a bit more, for information to spread. The douche, for example, to wash yourself out after intercourse, would help to reduce the possibility of pregnancy. If you knew where to look, there were adverts for these sorts of new ways of controlling your family size. And that's the word, controlling families, or being kind to your wife, thinking about the health of your good lady. That's often how it was phrased, that it was a duty of a husband, a decent husband from a respectable background, to ensure the health and well-being of his wife by limiting the number of children she had. It was all down to him. There were several attempts by people to spread this knowledge of how to control your family size to a wider proportion of the population. But interestingly, many of those in power tried to stop it. They didn't feel that this was information that people should have. They felt somehow that it was all very well for them as professional people to know about how to control family size, but the working classes couldn't really be trusted with such knowledge. So a great pamphleting campaign that goes on in the very beginning of Victoria's reign gets squashed. It's decided that these are obscene publications and they're banned. So it's really clear, if you look at birth records, that middle class families are having less children. They are practicing contraception, but the working classes are not. So there's a sort of silence going on, in which quiet discussions are had within certain groups of society about, you shouldn't let your wife have too many children, it's not healthy for her. She should be around in good health to bring up the children you already have, that this is the right thing to do, but not passing that information across to the rest of society. If you've enjoyed this series on Victorian Britain, make sure to check out the rest of our history courses on historyextra.com/academy.